right. Good morning and welcome to the morning briefing. It's Thursday, September 8th, and it's episode 196, drawing ever closer to episode 200, where you will experience some new formatting as we continue to improve our program based on your feedback. So keep getting us that feedback because we do take it seriously. I am Phil Brandt, President and CEO of AIM. And with me, as always, is your friend and mine, Bert Garland, legal expert and shareholder with Ogletree Deacons. Today, it's our goal always to bring you practical and timely, accurate insight into today's workplace, as it's our goal to keep you informed so you can more effectively lead your organization. Bert, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, Phil. It's a beautiful morning out there, and I know we've got a lot to talk about today. So I apologize for having to miss the broadcast last week, but I'm ready to roll today.
Oh, absolutely not. We know you're always got busy things to do, working either for your clients or our members, sometimes both. So that's more than okay. Business has to go on. Let's get on with the poll question because we do have a really busy schedule today. The poll question kind of comes off of last week's discussion, and I made the comment, the good old days, and that seemed to stir some feedback, as I'm not sure everyone's buying into the concept that these are the good old days for recruiting. So the poll question today is, in the next 3 to 5 years, will recruiting get easier, harder, or stay about the same? And in the comment section, I'd love to know why you think that will be what it is, easier, harder, or stay about the same. Let's see here. We have all kinds of topics to get into. Bert, there's two very important topics I want to get into. One is gender dysphoria and the rule of it as a disability. And I also want to talk about this thing, quiet quitting, and what might be happening there and what that really is. Seems to be a new fad, if you will, in the phraseology, if that's such a word, for us to talk about in the workplace, quiet quitting. But let's start with gender dysphoria first, Bert. I know there was a ruling about 2 weeks ago. Can you give us an overview of what we need to know so we can still run our business more effectively?
Yeah, so there was a case out of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers Virginia, a couple other states up east, and I'm not going to get into the details of all of it, of which states I'd have to look up. Well, and maybe I could do that real quickly, just so people know what they're talking about here. So the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals covers Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia. And so in those states, this is a federal court of appeals. In those states, the court issued a decision in the case of Williams versus Kincaid. They issued this decision on August 16th. And it does have some pretty significant potential impact for employers in those states, and maybe a sort of a sign of what's to come for employers in other states. And in this particular case, and I want to stress that this case came out of a prison. It related to an inmate in the prison. It was not an employment case, but what the court said here could have some implications in the employment realm. And specifically what the court basically said is that there is a big difference between what's known as gender identity issues or gender identity type claims, gender identity disorder specifically, and something known as gender dysphoria. And what they held here in this case is that gender dysphoria, which is when a person's gender, there's an incongruence or the person's gender does not match with what they feel. Okay, and so that's gender dysphoria. They don't match up with what they feel. And what the court basically held here, tried to boil it down somewhat simply, and Phil, you did a nice job during the pre-show, is that basically what the court is saying here is that the anxiety and the stress that's caused from gender dysphoria is in itself a disability. Gender identity in and of itself is not a disability, But if you suffer from something called gender dysphoria, and they separate this, the court separates it and they say gender identity disorder is something different from gender dysphoria. The court goes to, I would say, to, through some mental gymnastics to try to get to that point. The case is, the decision is 56 pages long. The dissent in this particular case is roughly 15 plus pages. And I will tell you, I absolutely positively 100% agree with the dissent in this case. And I'll explain that in a minute here, why I agree with the dissent. So if you take it, the district court down below granted the dismissal of this case, granted the defendant's dismissal of this case. So you have one judge saying that the defendants were right. And then on appeal, you have a 3-judge panel. And on this 3-judge panel, 2 of those judges said that the district court was wrong. And one of the judges said the district court was right. So now you've got 2 judges saying one thing, 2 judges saying another thing. I think this case is potentially heading to the Supreme Court for determination down the road, but people aren't interested in all of that. Like I said, though.
So Bert, if I kind of break it down in the pre-program, you and I were talking, and I kind of, what I read about this is I put it in a bucket like this, and maybe you can help our listeners understand what's accurate or not accurate about that bucket. One is someone who has has a gender identity crisis, if you will, or experience in their
gender identity disorder.
How about that? Yeah. That itself is not eligible for ADA.
Correct.
However,
and it is
someone that has experienced stress, or let's just call it a disabling outcome from that disorder, that disabling outcome or stress very well may be ADA.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to summarize it. It may not be 100% legally accurate, but I think it's, in layman's terms, it's a fair way to summarize it. The court, like I said, went through some mental gymnastics to distinguish between something called gender identity disorder, and I'll explain why they had to do that, and something called gender dysphoria. Okay, and so they created the second category here that we hear about in the news called gender dysphoria, and they say that gender dysphoria is covered by the ADA. That is a disability under the ADA, whereas gender identity order is not a disability under the ADA. Right. And you could see how that starts to get tough.
It's the disorder caused, or the stress, or the disabling attributes of the disorder.
It's the dysphoria. It's the actual dysphoria that is can be the disability. And I sent Nick some language here that I'll ask him to put up in a second, but I want to get to the quote from the dissent. And the reason why we're talking about this, of course, today is that if this becomes the law in the broader United States here, this could have implications for employers, that employers are going to have to accommodate individuals' gender dysphoria issues, any resulting potential disability from the gender dysphoria. Could be time off from work, could be bathrooms, could be requiring employers to refer to employees by their preferred pronouns. So again, I would assume
it could also have tentacles into your benefit programs and disability programs that also it may qualify them for.
It's possible that it could, and I think that we're trying to be on the cutting edge here, Phil, and trying to make employers aware of what's coming down the line and issues that they need to be thinking about in their place of employment. And so when the court goes through its 35 plus pages of analysis here and concludes that this individual, the plaintiff in this case, could state a claim for disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act, they are making a pronouncement here saying that gender dysphoria and the resulting mental illnesses that can arise from gender dysphoria, that is a disability in and of itself, and that's going to need accommodation. I want to stress that a few years ago, the Supreme Court, in its Bostock decision, we've talked about that on the program a few times, the Supreme Court in that case did say that gender identity and sexual orientation are protected already under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But that does not necessarily mean that you have to accommodate people. Okay, you just can't discriminate against people under Title VII. Title VII does not necessarily require accommodation. Okay, I guess in the religious sense it does, but generally Title VII does not require accommodation. It just requires you not to discriminate. The ADA, on the other hand, requires you to accommodate. And so with the majority's decision in this case, and again, I do think it's probably heading for the Supreme Court, with the majority's decision in this case, they're saying that, okay, yes, gender identity, sexual orientation, that's already protected under Title VII, but now we're saying that it's also protected under the ADA if you suffer from gender dysphoria. And so that's another big step, and that would require employers to make an accommodation for employees who are suffering from gender dysphoria. So I want to read, before Nick puts up this language, I want to read something that the dissenting judge said, because as folks on this program know me, they've listened to me for almost 200 episodes here. I'm what you would call a strict constructionist and or an original textualist.
Are you making up words kind of like quiet quitting, equivalent to disengaged?
It almost sounds that way, but I'm actually not. What I mean by that is that I take things that are written by Congress. I take the U.S. Constitution at its word. I try not to expand it. I try not to read other things into it. And in my opinion, that's Congress's job. If they don't like the outcome, it's Congress's job to change the law. It is not the court's job to engage in mental gymnastics to reach a desired outcome. And what I want to read here from the dissent is this. The dissenting judge says, my view here is not in any way a value judgment on the plaintiffs, those with gender dysphoria, or the broader transgender community. Likewise, I express no view here on the proper policy decisions concerning gender dysphoria or transgender issues. Those issues are outside my job description. Instead, I offer a legal judgment, nothing more, nothing less. Under the basic principles of statutory construction, Williams' ADA claim should be dismissed. Okay, so the judge tees it up, in my opinion, perfectly. He's saying here that that's not in his job description to decide whether or not gender dysphoria is a disability here. He's saying that's Congress's job. So why is he saying that? Nick, if you can put some language up that I sent you this morning. The judge is very clear on this, and this is actual text from the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the ADA specifically excludes certain conditions from the definition of disability. One of those things that is specifically excluded from the definition of disability is gender identity disorders that do not result from physical impairments. So if you have a gender identity disorder that is the result of a physical impairment, something's wrong with your genitalia, something like that, that could be a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But something that is just purely a mental issue, not a physical issue, but just a mental issue, that is specifically excluded from the definition of a disability. That's what Congress said. That's how Congress wrote the law. And what this court did to get through that, it's like I said, they distinguished between gender identity disorders, plural, and they created I guess judicially, they sort of created an exception here for gender dysphoria.
Mm,
And so
yeah.
what this judge is saying is that's not my job to decide whether gender dysphoria is different from a gender identity disorder. That's Congress's job. If Congress doesn't like it, Congress can go back and they can make an exception to the exception for gender dysphoria. It's not my job as a judge. And the ADA, as written, specifically excludes those gender identity disorders, of which gender dysphoria is one. And so, again, I think that the big point here is that if you're in those states, if you're in Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, you need to be careful right now in light of this decision. If you're an employer operating in those states, you may have some obligations to accommodate people who are suffering from gender dysphoria. In the broader U.S. right now, there are some district courts who have held consistently with this Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals opinion, namely out on the West Coast, not surprisingly, where you also need to be careful. Here in Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, I would still say that gender dysphoria is probably not a disability under the ADA, but it's something for all of us to keep our eye on. And again,
All
the
right.
distinction,
So,
Bill, real quickly, the distinction is that under the ADA, we have to accommodate.
right. So someone is at the office today and in through their door, they have someone who's filing for ADA accommodations because of this. Bert, what's the right thing for them to do at this point?
Well, the right thing to do, I'm not going to opine as to what the right thing to do or the correct thing to do from a social
What would be a good
perspective.
practice at this point?
Yeah. So from a practical legal standpoint, and again, it gets into that area of maybe you have the rights to do certain things, maybe you shouldn't do them. I'm not going to judge on that. But from a purely legal perspective, I would say in most states right now, that gender dysphoria is not a disability under the law, that is something that is specifically excluded under the ADA because it is a gender identity disorder. Now, again, it's a fine point here because anybody who's suffering from some sort of mental distress, no matter what the condition, the likelihood is that in and of itself may be a disability. And so you may not even need to reach the issue of the cause of the mental distress. And I think that would have frankly been an easier way for the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals to handle the issue. Yeah. They could have glossed by that. So in any event, I think that my suggestion for employers would be for them to focus on the mental distress aspect of this, just like they would treat any other employee who's experiencing stress and other mental disorders, and not focus on the cause of the mental disorder.
And, for me, that's the bucket it fits in for me is someone comes in and they have disabling stress. I'm not sure I'm overly concerned what's causing the stress, right? Because I know what causes my wife stress. I'm like, really? You're stressed over that compared to what causes me stress? They're in two different worlds. But nevertheless, it's stressful for her or it's stressful for other people. And it may or may not be as stressful for others. So for me, I'm not trying to divide what's causing the stress. It's whether or not they're certified that they have some level of disabling stress. And I'm going to use that in my interactive process to determine what decisions I might want to make.
Yeah, I think that's the upshot of it. And Nick, I sent you some charts from Bloomberg Law this morning that I think are worth putting up. And in particular, the one that's on the screen right now, it just shows the number of LGBT-based sex bias charges filed with the EEOC through the years. You started to see a jump in the 2014-2015 timeframe, and then it's remained somewhat consistent, just under 2,000 charges per year. So this is a growing trend, and while it represents a small part of the roughly 90,000 charges that are filed in any given year, if you are an employer that's facing one of these issues, it's serious and can lead to some pretty significant liability. And Nick, I sent another chart to you that shows what that liability could be. So if you can throw that up, there you go. So look at the amount recovered for victims of LGBT-based sex bias claims, how that's increasing over the years. So of those 1,800 or so charges of discrimination that are filed, a certain number of those go to trial, and then a certain number of those are won. And we're approaching almost $7 million recovered back in 2019 on those cases. And so, like I said, the liability exposure is significant. There's also the whole social aspect of it, and what kind of employer do you want to be? I'm not commenting on that one way or the other, but these are all things that you need to consider as an employer. One other thing that we'll point out here, another chart that Bloomberg put out showing back in 2008 of major employers, and I'm not sure what they define major employers as, but only 90 major employers had transgender inclusion in the workplace, whereas in 2022, by their measure, that's up to almost closing in on 700.
Yeah, that's a lot of growth in that area. So it does suggest that, I want to have I want to have high awareness if this thing walks through, this challenge walks through the door, and I have to help manage this carefully. And yes. I think at that point, it's one is maybe start the interactive process, get your legal advisor on discussion with you, and make a decision that I think you're balancing the risk and against maybe the accommodation, and determine whether or not that makes sense to do or not for your business. But it's muddy water at this moment.
Exactly. Yeah, clear as mud.
Clear as mud. All right. Nick, let's take a look at our poll results real quick before we transition to quiet quitting.
So we have, just as we would expect, or I would argue that people agree with you, Phil, that it's going to get harder. 85.7% believe it's going to get harder in the next 3 to 5 years to recruit, and whereas 14.3% say it'll stay about the same, and no one thinks it's going to get better.
And Nick, with you take a cut of that snippet you just made there, that where you said people agree with me, I want to use that later. I'll need that at home. That would be helpful for me.
Yeah, especially since you already threw your wife under the bus on this program.
Well, I just said what causes her stress doesn't always cause me stress, and vice versa. But yeah, I think there's no doubt, that's what the feds are trying to do as they're raising interest rate, is help make it easier for us by creating, an inflationary environment that puts us into a small recession, short-lived, to help provide some relief in wages and the hiring, so employers in the long term can continue their productivity on balance. But nevertheless, I do agree. I think it's going to be harder, and it's going to be harder for the most of our working careers if our country stays a high producing country as it has been for all of our lifetimes. Let's talk about this thing called quiet quitting, Bert.
Hey, Phil, before we do that, I do want to, there's a lot of coming in on the chat, and I'm not going to attribute it to anybody, but one comment that came in, and I think it's consistent with some of the other comments in there, I think it's really right on, is spot on. The listener says, in manufacturing, it's so hard to get people that want to work. Gone are the days when people had pride in having a job and showing up for work every day. With the size of the workforce decreasing, I don't see things improving, at least in manufacturing. Yeah. And then another listener says, for my industry, I believe it will get harder as we have many aging out of the workforce, which I think is another really good piece there, that, the workforce is really changing. And there is definitely going to be a talent drain in some of the skilled trades and in manufacturing. A lot of the trade schools during the Obama administration were basically put out of business through some laws that were passed, and that had to do with student loan fraud and those types of things, or that was the guise under which they were put out of business. But we're not educating a new crop of people to replace that aging workforce, that skilled workforce. So, things, I agree. I think things are going to be harder in certain industries.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, those are some great comments from Dina and Barbara Patty. Julie continues. I think it goes right into this topic. So many are leaving the on-site workforce for stay-at-home positions. Also, the competition for workers has caused an increase in starting wages for all grades, which make it hard to fill many positions. I mean, that's the competitive environment we live in. That's one of the reasons we do this program is to help people maneuver in these, because we can't, first to market versus second to follow could make all the difference in success and failure here in something clever. And I know we just had the Wayfinder HR Summit a couple of weeks ago, and it was all centered around creative and new innovative approaches to recruiting and staffing and retaining. And I will tell you, there's not a lot of new approaches, or just more creative approaches, if you will call it that. I mean, we're still trying to recruit talent. It's how we do that in a way that attracts, it's putting a little bit more flavor on our job descriptions and postings, and creating a little bit more desirable work environment, which for many people, they're dealing with managers who are saying, yeah, but you know what? I just want somebody that wants to come to work and do their job and not worry about this and not worry about that. And in the end, those days are gone. And if we don't worry about those things and put action into place, our workplace will not attract the talent we need to attract. It's just not there. There will be winners and there will be losers. And I'll continue to support that until the numbers suggest something different.
Hey, Phil, we're getting close to the end here. Quiet quitting.
Quiet. I just was quitting quietly, Bert. Why do you have to bring that up?
Sorry.
All right. So let's talk about it. This is all due to a TikTok craze, right? So we're all talking about it, but in the end, what exactly is it? It's just another way of saying actively not engaged, right? And about 50% of Americans' workforce has been actively not engaged. Quiet quitting almost fits exactly that same definition, according to Gallup. What they're saying is people who do the minimum required and are physically detached from their job, psychologically detached from their job. This describes about half of the U.S. workforce. I personally think there's a connection between working from home and hybrid, and you're not around your coworkers and you don't get that collaboration, because much of it focuses on the extra effort that it takes to collaborate and be a team player and serve the customer. And it's really hard to collaborate and be a team player when maybe you've never met your coworkers in person. Maybe you've never been in the office that you now work for. And it doesn't create an environment that's easy for collaboration to occur. They say it really falls within the millennial and Gen Z, younger millennials and Gen Z population, those below the age of 35. And they're saying that it really starts to become a management problem. Again, none of this is new, right? They're saying first we have to address, in order to solve this problem, the managers. And we've been talking about managers who can create engagement, who can excite employees and keep employees engaged in the work, focused on the goal, are always more valuable than those managers who disengage people by their actions and behaviors. So the more we can invest in our managers and our supervisors with tools to teach them how to create engagement, that is going to be the best way to combat this. They're also saying that they would suggest that each manager or supervisor has 15 to 30 minute one-on-one meaningful conversations per week with their employees. And I can tell you firsthand, there are many, many employers who don't allot for that time for someone to sit with their manager for 15 or 30 minutes through the week for a meaningful conversation that would result in engagement. Nick, last thing, pull up the engagement chart, please. This is from Gallup, some interesting trends occurring here. So if we look at the Gallup trend here, we can see that going right back to just about 2009 through recent times, of 2020, we had engagement increasing in the workplace for the first time in who knows how long, but the first time in my working career. We've seen a nice little trend of increasing engagement. And then for a little while there, we had decreasing actively disengaged numbers. And what we've seen since 2020, approximately that time, is we've seen the trends just go in opposite direction. We're seeing actively disengaged going up with engagement going down. I don't believe that's a coincidence when we look at people working from home and people not being around the workplace where they get the opportunity to be engaged by managers and leaders and the work environment. And I also don't believe that it's a coincidence that we have the great resignation occurring. When I know I have options, it allows me to get my mind going. And all of a sudden I think, the grass might be greener on the other side. These are real numbers. I think that's a real issue, whether you want to call it actively disengaged or quietly quitting. That makes no difference to me. I think they're one and the same. But nevertheless, the solution, I think, is unchanged. And that is having a leadership and management team that knows how to create engagement for the benefit of the work environment.
Phil,
so that's my little soapbox on actively disengaged or quietly quitting. Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, no, to support you even more, we do we interview employees when we do employment branding type of videos and corporate videos for corporations. And we ask, a lot of questions on what you like about working here. Every single time, the number one answer is always the people.
It's people.
Always
it's
the
always
people.
The people. The number one reason, we've said it on the program before, is they like their coworkers. They stay because they have friends at work. People who don't have friends at work leave. And the second reason is their manager. They will leave because of their manager, or they will stay because of their manager. So how do we create more friends at work, and how do we improve the skills and abilities of our leaders and managers? With that, we have to close out. We will see you next week back here Thursday at 7:30 Central Time. Bye-bye.
Tell your story, promote your products, communicate with your employees and customers vividly, dynamically, and powerfully. Whether it's a company video, recruitment video, online training, or live meeting, Feature Group can help you, from scripting to highly polished finished production. Whether it's live or on demand, we have the skills and equipment to wow your audience and drive your message home. Feature Group USA, the one-stop shop for all your broadcasting needs.